And I welcome everyone to Press TV's News Review program, where we get in depth in one of the day's top stories. China has lashed out at the U.S. after President Joe Biden said that Washington will defend Taiwan militarily if Beijing invades the self-ruled island.
We deplore and reject the U.S. remarks. Taiwan is an inimitable part of the Chinese territory. The Taiwan issue is purely China's internal affair, which won't stand for any foreign interference. Issues bearing on China's core interests, including the sovereignty and territorial integrity, there's no room for compromise or concession. No one should underestimate the Chinese people's firm resolution, will, and capability to defend its national sovereignty and territorial integrity, and should not stand against the 1.4 billion Chinese people.
The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman also called on the U.S. to earnestly abide by the One China principle and refrain from supporting Taiwan's independence. Official warned Washington that its meddlesome approach will harm bilateral ties. China has time and again warned the U.S. against increased military and political support for Taiwan. China considers the island as part of its territory. And now joining us for the program here on Press TV is John Ross, Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, joining us out of London, and Daniel Lazar, journalist and author, joining us from New York. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. I guess, Mr. John Ross in London, we're going to start with you. Now, the U.S. president says that he respects the One China policy. At the same time, he's vowing and pledging to defend Taiwan and support its independence from China. A complete lack of coherence in U.S. policy. Your initial thoughts, sir?
Well, this is just the next step in an escalation which the United States has been carrying out on Taiwan. It knows perfectly well that the One China policy was the basis on which relations between the United States and China were established following Nixon's visit to Beijing in 1972. And the United States is now trying to erode it by every way possible. They invited for the first time a delegation from Taiwan to the inauguration of the president, although it's not a government, it's not a state or anything. It's increasing the going to Taiwan. And this is the latest stage in this. This is part of a US international escalation, not only against China, but against other countries. For example, Russia, that knew perfectly well, the US created the war in Ukraine because it knew perfectly well that Ukraine being part of NATO was unacceptable to Russia. So this is part of an aggression which the United States is carrying out against countries, and this is...
Thank you, Mr. Ross. And Daniel Lazar, I'd like to welcome you to the program. Now, Daniel, China feels that the U.S. over-exaggerates Beijing's role as some kind of global threat, but that it's using that to justify basically going horn to horn with China in the South China Sea, in trade, obviously in Hong Kong, and now in Taiwan. My question to you, is this an over-exaggerated threat that the U.S. wants to push on the rest of the planet, or is it justified?
Oh, well, the threat comes from the U.S., not from China. The Biden administration has been on the warpath. The Biden administration, Joe Biden, thought that Donald Trump was dangerously slack. He was not confrontational enough with either Russia or China. So when he got into office in January 2021, he resolved to get tough. America is back. That's what he declared whenever he went abroad. And we're seeing the results. The results in Eastern Europe is a major war between Russia and the Ukraine, and NATO, of course, as well. And the result in the Western Pacific is a dangerous escalation of tensions between the U.S. and China. And Joe Biden's latest Freudian slip, where he said the U.S. would actually go to war in defense of Taiwan, even though that is not official U.S. policy. But this is the latest provocation by the U.S. in the Western Pacific, and it shows that U.S. policies are leading to a dramatic increase in tensions in that part of the world as well. So we have war in Eastern Europe, and we have a dangerous escalation of tensions in the Western Pacific. So the question is, When does that in the Western Pacific lead to outright war? And the danger is certainly growing.
And maybe you could help us look into that, Mr. John Ross. The situation that's unfolding and that will continue to basically unfold in Ukraine, how will that impact U.S. policy when it comes to China and Taiwan?
Well, it depends on the outcome of the war. I think that the United States is feeling, to use a Chinese phrase, crossing the river, feeling the stones beneath its feet. Ukraine is something new. The United States has attacked numerous developing countries, obviously Iraq, Syria, Libya. It's invaded numerous countries in Latin America. This is totally unjust. It's horrible. But nevertheless, of course, the United States did not run any military risk in this because it was attacking much weaker opponents. To have a confrontation with Russia is something totally different. Even the US is careful about this. It's not prepared to commit US ground troops to the Ukraine. It's prepared to give enormous numbers of weapons. And this indicates, because it doesn't know exactly what the result would be. After all, it's confronting the only country in the world, that is Russia, which has the nuclear weapons which can completely destroy the United States. So the US will see what is the outcome of the war. If the US loses the war, because that's the real war, it's not a war between Ukraine and Russia, this is a proxy war between the United States and NATO and Russia. If the United States loses the war, then it will become more cautious. If it, on the contrary, wins the war, then it will become more aggressive. That's the general pattern. When the US suffers defeats, it suddenly becomes peace-loving, as when it was defeated in Vietnam. And when it feels strong, it becomes aggressive. So if it loses the war in Ukraine, the US will become more cautious. And if the US wins the war in Ukraine, then it will become more aggressive. So at the same time, it's carrying out some escalations with China around Taiwan, preparing grounds for a bigger confrontation. And it will hesitate to see what is the outcome of the war in Ukraine before deciding how far it's prepared to go in the confrontation with China.
Thank you, sir. And Daniel, where do you feel the U.S. plan, what do you think the U.S. plan is when it comes to tensions? How far is the U.S. willing really to go with China? What would a conflict with China look like on a much smaller scale if we don't really entertain conflict with China, trying to contain China in a protracted sense? What would that even look like? Because we've seen the economic global fallout from what's going on with respect to Russian sanctions over the Ukraine war.
Well, first of all, a U.S.-China war would be horrible, disastrous, a bloody mess. It would be horrible. The U.S. policy is getting more aggressive. It's getting pushier and pushier. Now, the U.S. hope is that it can keep on pushing without actual war erupting, because China will simply back off without a fight. So we saw what happened in the Ukraine. That was a U.S. strategy in the Ukraine as well. Keep pushing, 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 engaging in ever more provocative actions in the hope that Russia would not respond. Well, guess what happened? Russia responded, and we have a bloody situation on our hands. The same danger exists in the Western Pacific, where the U.S. is pushing ever more aggressively, but somehow keeping its fingers crossed that China will not respond militarily. But the harder that the U.S. pushes, the greater the chances of a Chinese military response. So the U.S. is really flirting with disaster here. And if it doesn't stop its policies, its current policies, increasingly aggressive policies, then it'll wind up with a really frightful situation on its hands.
All right, good stuff, gentlemen. Thank you both for joining us on the program. John Ross from London and Daniel Lazar joining us out of New York. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.